The following is the story of a 15-year-old girl named Sage Lily. The author, her adopted mother, who happens to be her grandmother, wants the world to know what is happening to vulnerable, trans-identified children like her daughter. When we received her story, we immediately got her in touch with people in our network who could be in position to help her, and to get her story visibility with a broader audience. All of that is currently in motion. Please take the time to read this heartbreaking story for yourself. And this is what the young girl looks like, which is that as well. I am the grandmother of a 15-year-old young girl, Sage Lily. I adopted Sage when she was just shy of 2 years old. Sage and I live in Virginia with my husband. Sage started going through gender confusion in 8th grade. To that point, she was a straight A student who enjoyed playing piano and writing poetry. At her small school, as Sage informed me, all the girls were either bi, trans, or lesbian. At some point, social influence overcame her. She advised her friends and teachers that she wanted to be trans and that Sage would no longer be her name. She requested to be called Draco and referred to as a boy. The school obliged, since Virginia, by law, requires that students be affirmed by the school staff. Unfortunately, the school did not tell me, her legal mother, about any of this. I was left in the dark. I wish I had known. If I had known, this would have been a much different story. Last August, in 2021, Sage started 9th grade at the local high school with her trans identity in place. Unbeknownst to me, she was bullied and became extremely vulnerable. Soon, she was exploited online, a fact I did not know about until later. On August 25th, she ran away from home. I immediately notified the local sheriff. Her case quickly escalated and the FBI and U.S. Marshal Service became involved. Sage had been trafficked from Virginia into Washington, D.C., and then transported to Maryland. The FBI and marshals found her in a locked room at the home of the abuser at 10 p.m. on September 2nd. So she spent whatever the distance between August 25th and September 2nd, which is, I don't even want to do the math because I don't want to think about it, but that's how long. And called me to let me know and to inform me that I could pick her up the next morning to bring her home to Virginia. I was told she needed to stay the night at a detention center as she was being treated at a hospital and needed a kit for assault completed. I was frantic, as you might imagine, and distraught that I was not allowed to see her right away. I arrived at the detention center bright and early the next morning. However, once there, I received surprising and devastating news. Sage was now being represented by a juvenile attorney and would not be allowed to return to Virginia with us. And I would not be allowed to see her until a court hearing could take place. And on top of that, my husband and I were going to be investigated for abuse because we called her Sage and not Draco, and female pronouns in reference to her rather than he, him. Abuse charges were filed against my husband and myself, and Sage was put in the boys' unit of the children's home, where she was again abused. Following this, she was placed in a private room. Again, I was not advised that Sage, with a female body, was placed in a boys' unit. So now my traumatized child has been kidnapped, trafficked, and then abused again while in the care of the state. Rather than returning to her loving home to rebuild, instead of the trauma care that Sage desperately needed when she was rescued, she was manipulated and our family was treated unfairly. Instead of getting the help she desperately needed and deserved, she was fated to experience even more pain and suffering. After an investigation by both Maryland and Virginia DSS, the abuse charges were determined to be unfounded. Yet Sage still was not allowed to come home. Instead, she was put on center stage to push a political and gender agenda for a Maryland public defender with clearly no knowledge of trauma caused by exploitation of a child. A typical 14-year-old is emotionally mature and struggles with many issues. Sage had additional issues on top of these normal concerns, as she had experienced severe trauma before the age of 2. Now with this new trauma of being trafficked, she was even more vulnerable. Despite the therapeutic programs in Virginia that were willing and able to accept her, the Maryland public defender attorney said Sage could not go because of the trans identification. And the Maryland Juvenile Court judge agreed. On November 8th, 2021, the Maryland judge had finally released Sage to a facility in Virginia. This was immediately appealed the next day, and Maryland continued to retain custody of my child, hoping to place Sage in a foster home in Maryland. Why? Because I called her Sage, her legal name, and not Draco. In this case, it was simply because my husband and I could not remember to, because desperate to get our child back, we would have done anything, including using the name Draco. Now our abused child, the victim of federal trafficking, was being sent to a foster home because of gender ideology. There is no way to interpret that this was in my child's best interests. And to make matters worse, one day on November 12th, 2021, Sage did not return to the children's home after school. She had run away again. Law enforcement and the National Center for Missing Children and the FBI were all notified. At that point, I could only hope and pray that Sage was not back in the hands of the predators. I prayed she was still alive. Everyone should have been looking for her. Instead, the Maryland appeal remained active, and the attorneys were focused on using her to establish case law for transgender individuals. This was the Maryland attorney's main intention, and it was to be accomplished at the risk of my child's mental health and now her life. To my horror, the Maryland marshal found that Sage had been sent from Maryland to Dallas, Texas. On January 24th, 2022, the Texas marshal, through the grace of God, found her locked in a room where, once again, she had been abused by a predator. So, once again, to calculate those dates, she ran away November 12th, 2021, and was not found until January 24th, 2022. This young lady is nearly 3 years younger than I am. Just to put that into perspective, if you guys think I'm young, just imagine such a much worse thing happening to a much younger person. He had used her for content, sold her body for money, starved her, beat her, and drugged her. It was a true miracle that she was found. So many children are never found, but her exploitation would never have happened in the first place if not for the intervention of the state of Maryland. Now Sage is in a residential therapeutic facility for the next 1 to 2 years, depending on how well she responds to the program. She will struggle with these consequences for the rest of her life. She is now only 15 years old. She spent her 15th birthday, October 20th, in Maryland, and I was not even allowed to visit her. I cried all day that day. I want to share her story with anyone and everyone who will listen. I am just one small voice for thousands of these children that our society is endangering by passing laws that give them more rights than the parents who are there to safeguard and protect them. I won't dig any further into the story because it's mostly fluff. I don't need to dig much deeper into it. But also to anybody who is doubtful of the validity of this story, the validity, that's the right word. That's the right word. The validity of this story. This is a news article chronicling the fact that Sage Lily, who was at the time a resident of Virginia, from Concord, it would appear, was lost, and then as of updated September 3rd, 2021, found, and then as stated in the story, lost again, and I'm sure there's another article for that, but here's another picture of the young lady. Doesn't look much younger than me, but is, a little younger than me, blue hair, cut short, boyish style. These are the things that are pushed on you in middle school and high school, and unfortunately, a lot of people fall victim to it. It's a pipeline, and unfortunately, there's nothing that you can do to fight against it. There's nothing you can do, at least for your own children, in the eyes of the government. You can't refer to them by their birth name. You can't do any of that, at least in some states. It would appear in Texas, though, things are a little better, but if your child ends up in Maryland, you might not have that freedom. This isn't supposed to scare you. This isn't even supposed to make you angry. This is supposed to raise awareness. I'm just amplifying this lady's story. I'm amplifying this young lady's story. I want everyone to know what can happen if you are not vigilant, and what can happen if we allow this agenda to press forward. Is every single gay person a predator? No. Is every single transgender person abused and or a predator? No. Are these things likely? Are these things a possibility? Yes. It's of course the same possibility of a straight person. In fact, I would not be surprised if some of these predators that had abused this young lady were in fact straight men. But it all comes down to a heed that we are embracing this and allowing this to be pushed on children that do not have the maturity to defend themselves and protect themselves against predators. I know that when I went through middle school, there was a massive push of the LGBT. It was a major thing. And that's even in red state, normal Georgia. Now, of course, I am in the Atlanta area, so things are a little bit more blue and a little bit more progressive. But I've heard these things even in more rural counties of Georgia. It's at a lesser extent, but it's still there. It is pushed on this generation. It is pushed on TikTok. So I'm not saying this to be an alarmist. I'm not saying this to scare you, but you need to be careful. You need to be vigilant, because anybody could be this woman here. This woman could have been anybody. She could have been one of our viewers. She could have been one of you. So that all goes to say, be careful and stay safe. I'm going to read a few comments before we wrap things up.